Thanks for coming, everybody. And I want to thank Cambridge for having me here today, for the invitation. I was here 2 years ago as a participant, and I was thrilled when I got the email with better learning in the subject area, and even more thrilled when I saw that it was an invitation to speak. So I thank Karen and Joe. So, well, I've been working in the field of ESL for many, many years, and during the past 25 years, I've been working with teachers in Minnesota, where we have among the highest number of refugees per capita in the United States. And how many languages do you think are spoken in the homes of families in Minnesota, just in Minnesota? Well over 100, okay? So we have a long tradition of supporting the needs of newcomer families, the parents, the children, in the resettlement process, and helping them to thrive and find the best opportunities possible in their settings. Now, as Rupert said, I've also worked with teachers in Vietnam, in India, Bangladesh, and it's the same thing. I think all teachers are hoping that their learners will be able to transition to whatever's next for them, right? We all want learners to thrive in their lives, in their communities. And doing that in English can be more complex than ever when you're doing that in a second language. So today we're going to be thinking about the complexity of tasks that we have to do in today's world and how that relates to language development and language teaching, and define rigor in the context of language teaching. And then finally, we're going to explore some supports that we need to give learners so that they can have those kind of successes in meeting those demands of the 21st century, but also looking really closely at the intersection with language development. So to start off with, let's think about tasks that you do in your lives, okay? So if you could just raise your hand when I give the amount, how often do you collaborate with others using technology? Every day? 5 times a day? Probably more than that, right? How often do you use information to draw conclusions or make decisions? Once a week? Twice a week? Once a day? Hourly? Right? Okay, all right. How about interpret information presented in multiple formats? So sort of graphic literacy, graphs, tables, charts, infographics. Weekly? Daily? Okay, right? Okay, good. Good. And how about create new ideas and materials? All the time, right? Okay. And then adapt your language to a variety of contexts and communicative tasks. All the time, right? Okay. And then engage in team projects. All the time, right? Okay. So I thought about my experience coming here and how I employed a lot of these skills. I had to interact using technology with the folks here at Cambridge. I had to share my PowerPoint with Wendy on a cloud. I had to think about what would be the most interesting way to present the information for you on the slides, right? Do you see which ones I'm using here? I thought about that last one about my register when I was talking to friends and family about what I'd be talking about. I said, well, it's all about beefing it up in language instruction, challenging students. But when I talk to you, I might use terms like rigor, 21st century skills. So right, my register changes depending on my audience, right? So let's take a closer look at engage in team projects. And I want you to talk 1 minute. When I raise my hand, we'll come back together. What skills or language or what you need to be able to do to have a successful team project. Oftentimes when you're working on a team on something, you have some kind of project or product that you're working towards, so you have to find and evaluate resources together, potentially. Maybe analyze that information. Synthesize information from multiple sources, so that might be both what you've read, maybe you've watched a YouTube video, or you listened to a TED Talk, and also the information that your colleagues are sharing with you. You have to synthesize all that information and pull it together and interpret information presented in multiple formats and then communicate effectively with one another. And a big part of that is being able to elaborate and build on others' ideas, right? Okay, and then finally create some kind of a product. And that product might be written, it might be oral, it might be visual. All of those tasks, the things that we've thought about already, I would say they fall into a number of categories. For example, communication, collaboration, effective communication and collaboration, accessing complex texts. Okay, some of those are digital, some of those are print, some of them are presented graphically. So it's not just reading. And oftentimes when you think back to the way we learn languages, I don't know about you, but it was often reading a text and answering questions. But does that represent the ways that we use literacy in the real world? Right, we need to engage students with multiple literacies and also give them the tools to access things that are more complex. We're solving problems all the time using, in a very digitally complex environment as well. And then finally, critical thinking, creative and critical thinking, right? So this is not unique. This is really a global shift, okay? So it all started with the Partnership for 21st Century Skills that started in the 2000s, and the report came out around 2009. In Minnesota, my colleague and I, we did a study in 2010 where we surveyed community college faculty and then adult ESL faculty. So those folks who are working with adults in the adult basic education system. And we looked at what were the alignments and what were the gaps in terms of what the teachers were working on and what the faculty said you needed for success. And we found a lot of gaps, actually. In particular, really higher order reading and listening strategies, like synthesizing information from multiple sources, making inferences, that sort of thing. Or using technology, leveraging technology for learning. Autonomy was a big one. So the ESL and the ABE teachers weren't working on those things very often, whereas the college faculty were saying you really need that for success, okay? Does that surprise you? Does that sound like you might have similar results in your settings? Potentially, right? Okay, so we developed a framework called the Transitions Integration Framework, or the TIF, which articulates things like navigating systems, learning strategies, critical thinking, and so it's got some really kind of neat similarities with the Cambridge framework that Ben's talked a lot about. And we also have the college and career readiness standards in the US, and with that, English language proficiency standards that are designed to help English learners meet these rigorous standards. Of course, the OECD framework, Global Competency Framework, and then the Cambridge. And what I love about the Cambridge Life Competencies Framework is the very teacher and learner-friendly can-do statements. And these later frameworks have brought in more than things like critical thinking, navigating systems. They also have self-awareness, advocacy, thinking about diversity, okay? So those are great complements to that. But I think teachers are still challenged. They see themselves as the ones who teach listening, speaking, reading, writing, grammar, vocabulary, pronunciation, pragmatics. Where does this all fit into the classroom with language teachers? Now, we are starting a new project in the States through the US Department of Education for adult education called Teaching the Skills That Matter, and we'll be doing some coaching and developing materials for teachers because we found that these are things that teachers have a hard time sort of operationalizing in the language setting, okay? So now what does this all have to do with rigor? Because the title was Rigor from the Get-Go. There's a book by Blackburn called Rigor is Not a Four-Letter Word, and she identifies these areas. It's all about setting high expectations for learners, okay? Providing the supports they need for learning, and then finding ways to have students demonstrate their learning, okay? And I think a lot of parallels to things that we've been talking about this week. Now, in the context of the language classroom, this is how I see these three elements, that the rigorous learning outcomes, you can draw on those from whatever your curriculum is, but you can also draw on it from these frameworks that are out there to help to articulate, well, what do these 21st century skills look like in the classroom? What do they mean for me? I'm also adding here content that matters. Having things that are, when I said beefing it up before, or having meaty content. Not just, I'll give you an example from my setting. I work with teachers who student teach in a community-based program. And one of the learning outcomes is, or one of the themes is transportation, being able to read bus schedules. And the teacher said, well, I think the learners have figured that one out. I mean, I think they can ask a friend, right? So they ended up doing a lesson on the benefits of a new light rail system that went right through a neighborhood that's largely immigrant, newcomer populations, don't have cars, need to get to work. So we're gonna evaluate what are the benefits, right? Oops, I'm sorry. And then we need to provide scaffolds to engage with these more complex tasks and texts. And then finally, create products, okay? So I'm gonna go through each of these in turn, starting off with the meaty and meaningful content. So again, in our setting, we do a lot of like health literacy. This may not be a content area that you would cover necessarily in your settings, but I think you can see what you could do instead in place of this. We were doing units on health with the teachers. and the learners, but I was working with the teachers, and they were doing things like accessing information about insurance online, talking about symptoms, going to the doctor, and then they also had a reading about the dangers of a sedentary lifestyle. So we found this graphic for the US Census Bureau that talks about average time on different leisure activities a day. And it's really striking, right? Do you notice that watching TV, 2 hours and 47 minutes? So the activity that we engage the students with in order to meet this standard, so integrate and evaluate content presented in diverse media and formats, we can work on it with these meaty, authentic texts that are so accessible. You can find these, and they can be situated to your context. Look for data from an organization that represents a topic in your unit that you're working on, or with the teachers, I mean. So the teachers worked on making comparisons, comparing, well, they spend much more time watching TV than participating in sports. We talked about making a claim with evidence. So do you think that these are healthy habits or not? Right? Healthy? Unhealthy? I don't know. Well, we looked at it really closely. We thought about which ones can be done alone or with others, which ones are indoors, outdoors, which ones have activity. So there was a lot of language development. You might do that. They even worked on some modal verbs of probability or possibility. But at the same time, then think about the 21st century skills, interpreting information presented in different formats, a lot of critical thinking skills. And then we also delved into the idea of, well, who does this represent? Whose voice is here? Does it represent the students themselves? And of course, you know what's in the news with the whole question about census. And, so these are critical issues that we can bring into the classroom. Another one, I took a can-do statement from the framework that students get involved in collective action about local, national, global issues in their community. Now that's kind of a tall order for somebody who's in an English language classroom. Maybe it's not so much that we can measure that they've done it, but we can certainly develop the dispositions and the mindset of thinking about being engaged in your community. So for this one, and this is an activity we're using with that Teaching Skills That Matter project, is, okay, we've got this authentic text, which is the social change wheel, and it has a variety of different ways that you become engaged in your community. But first, the learners think about, well, what do you do right now? What are the ways that you're engaged in your community? And then collaboratively, they look at the wheel and see where are they situated. Now, this wheel is really quite advanced linguistically, so I also created a much simpler form that just has volunteerism, community action, community building. So I've made a smaller wheel. But the idea here is that we're bringing in content that's really meaty and more engaging than what might be in a curriculum that you're using. Now, hopefully you have books that you choose that have this sort of thing in them, but I'm showing you that you can always add this layer. So you're sort of adding a layer of rigor, communication, because the learners work on it collaboratively, a lot of critical thinking, challenging their own assumptions about what the possibilities might be. So that's the things that matter, okay? The other scaffolds I want to highlight, there are many scaffolds, right? There's building background knowledge, peer support, translanguaging, which having learners leverage all of their linguistic repertoire and abilities to get a task done. But I'm going to focus on two today, graphic organizers and language frames. And there's a great study by Jiang, and it's reported on in Jiang and Grabe's article, where she looked at college students in China and she had a control group and then her group that one had graphic organizers while reading tasks with the national curriculum they were using, and one just did business as usual, which was basically reading and answering comprehension questions. So Jiang, she created a series of graphic organizers that matched the text types that students were working on. And they found that actually the test scores for the group went way up as compared to the control group. And Pauline Gibbons talks a lot about the need to, if we want students to engage in these complex activities and tasks, we know that that's going to be more engaging. That kind of goes back to what Sarah talked about yesterday as well. So, but we need the language to do it. So we need to give language frames and supports, okay? And Jeff Zweers is an expert within the United States that I really like. He's out in California, and he works with English learners in the mainstream. So newcomer English learners so it's much like what you'd be doing in a CLIL setting or an English medium school. So those are people you might want to take a look at if you haven't already. So let's start with graphic organizers. Now, how many of you use graphic organizers of some kind in your schools? You see that, the teachers using that in your curricula? This one is so simple, a T-chart, but I want you to think the learners are going to do a reading on personality and birth order. And they get together in groups according to their own birth order, firstborns, middle children, lastborns, only children. And they just have to brainstorm together what are the pros and the cons, or the drawbacks and benefits of their birth order. Now, I want you to watch this clip of the students in that class taking part in the T-chart task. Where do you see a layer of 21st century skills being added to this language lesson? So business as usual might be read the reading, everybody reads the article, we answer some questions, but what if we start off with this rich pre-reading, okay, using a graphic organizer, all right? So.
Because for me, I gotta take care of my parents when I got older, and then
I think when you are just a child,
I gotta go to school.
yes,
That is a struggle more.
the older
You
usually
struggle more. The second one, you choose what your second.
we already
Your
practice
older
enough
sister,
in
you
our
practice.
first. Right.
You learn from.
Giving only one handout per group assures that learners collaborate to complete the task.
We can put it that way.
sisters.
I got it right. We are all brothers or sisters, but
Right.
and
You feel left out because the
feel
older
left
get
out?
more attention.
You
How
only
about
get
that?
more attention, and
The
those are
olders
the
and the
youngest
baby
ones.
usually do.
so what will be?
Think of the clothes, you always get the leftovers.
That's what I
or
said.
the,
Oh yeah.
So what's your group now?
As a pre-reading, it really sets the stage now for actually working with the text. So to work with the text, the reading that we used in the class, so I was as a sort of a coach, I was in the classroom with George, and we had this reading, and it was, of course, beautiful for a jigsaw because it had the 4 birth orders. So each group was assigned their portion of the reading for their birth order, and all they had to do was read and fill in what are some traits and what are some typical professions, which in and of itself is a pretty lower order reading task. It's just reading, scanning, and filling in the information. But let's see what happens by virtue of choosing this strategy. Let's see what happens when the learners stand up, mingle, and have to fill in the entire graphic organizer to learn about the entire text, rather than just reading and answering questions. And do you see evidence that there's more of those 21st century skills involved?
Well, can I see your paper? What's the problem with Roberto's paper?
It's not finished.
It's not finished. So how does he finish it?
Write all the 4 and 2.
No, maybe go and ask everyone.
Ask everybody.
Now, the pieces of the reading are put together.
First, youngest, and only child.
Yeah, first, lastborn or youngest, and only child. And who's the only child here?
No.
Allah. So Allah's going to be very busy. Is that okay, Allah? It gives the students a visual tool where they can visually see the different parts laid out in front of them. But the problem is it's not completed. So what they have to do is they have to interact with each other to find the information to fill out each part. And then they can see how any piece of nonfiction has different points that literally support a central idea. And so it reinforces what we've been teaching throughout the course, that to look for main ideas, find supporting details, and see how they relate to one another.
Any graphic organizer, like the tree diagram, can help learners see the organization of a text.
I've been saying hi. I've been calling her and to wait for you. I missed you. All right. Hello first.
Are you a perfect?
I think yes, well organized. Lunches, yeah.
Well organized? Why you are well organized? Okay.
Because I know
anything
what
else?
I have to do. You don't understand. When I grew up, I feel always high expectations from
last
my
one,
parents.
all the way.
Because I was just expectation from my parents.
Yeah, I made it.
So when usually if you only one child in the family, you have to achieve a lot in life.
Compared to answering comprehension questions, exchanging information from the text promotes deeper understanding of the reading.
No, not take off. You ask me this? Yeah. Like I take over your paper. Lucky?
I'm right. High expectation. High expectation.
Now, as I'm working with teachers and as you work with teachers, kind of this model of coaching and co-teaching and kind of trying things out together is a great way. But then I also say, well, what's the evidence that what do you see? What did you hear? For example, Allah says, no, that's not what I said. So, we're looking to see how does this develop language skills, like clarifying or building on others' ideas, right? Right? What else? Did you notice? Yeah, absolutely. And you know how, do your teachers use Jigsaw sometimes? You use this? Okay. Well, I hope you will. They will, okay. Work on it with them together. To follow up on what you just said, negotiation. Yes, okay. By virtue, again, what I'm trying to say is we operationalize these skills by virtue of the types of tasks we choose to do. But would that negotiation happen if you just read the article and answered questions, right? Yeah, probably not, right? No, exactly. Okay, and then the last scaffold we want to think about is the language frames that I talked about earlier. And there's a book by Richard and all that's called Making Thinking Visible that I just love. And it's this idea that students have critical thoughts and ideas, but they maybe don't have the language to verbalize that, right? So you have to provide the frames, but you have to provide the right kinds of frames, like how to elaborate and clarify if you want that to happen, or how do you paraphrase ideas, or build on others' ideas, or challenge a partner's ideas. And Jules Weirs talks about using these frames as a way to fortify the ideas, or fortify students' language. Okay, so now we're gonna put this all together. I'm sorry. Got ahead of myself. The third area, we need products. So as I said, so we have content that matters, scaffolds to work towards meeting those content standards, and then having real-world tasks as your outcomes. And those could be things like posters, presentations, podcasts, videos that the students create. We often think of products as being part of project-based learning, but I would argue we could have products at the end of any lesson. And that's going to replicate those real-world tasks much more authentically than the sorts of things we might just do in sort of our more communicative final activity in a classroom. So we're going to pull this all together. And I have a book that's just hot off the press, teaching adult English language learners. And we're going to look at a sample that kind of pulls all of these ideas together, okay? So we're going to start in this class with a Venn diagram, we're going to talk about the science of happiness. So is that a meaty topic, do you think? Sort of thinking about our principle of content that matters. So there's a lot of literature on the science of happiness. There are a lot of studies that's looked at the science of happiness. So the students will just first construct their own definition of what does happiness mean to them, and my definition, my partner's definition, what are things that are the same, what's unique to each of in our views, and then how are things similar. And then we're going to move on to doing a jigsaw reading. I have 4 volunteers, if you could come up here now. If you got a paper from me before, come on up. So we've decided we're going to do a jigsaw. There are 4 techniques written about in an article on the science of happiness, and they look at happiness boosters, things that you can do to make yourself feel better. Thank you. Come on up. Okay. Now, do we have a handheld mic? Yeah, okay. Now, these wonderful learners that might be in one of your teacher's classes, they've already done their task, and their task was to read one happiness booster, read about one happiness booster. What is the happiness booster? And you notice I've underlined words in their paragraphs that helps them find their definition. So kind of the signal words were underlined, okay? And then I bolded the language that was used in the text to show how we present results to other people. And so what the learners have done is they've been given one of 4 happiness boosters, and they've had to fill in a chart like this. Okay? So they have a graphic organizer again, the 4 techniques, and the results. Now, if you notice, what this does is it helps to make a complex text much more accessible because you're only responsible for a quarter of the text. I've also given you the scaffold of highlighting those key words, those language functions that are going to help you find the information you need. And then let's see the degree to which this promotes more collaboration and effective communication. Okay, so back to what I said. They've each done the task already earlier this morning. They're such studious pupils. And now we're going to give them some language frames. Do you think that would be helpful to have some language frames? It was found that. The studies showed that. Okay, so come on over. Make a group. Okay, now I want you to watch as they present what they read about to one another. Really do listen carefully and see which of the happiness boosters sound intriguing to you. Which ones might you try in your own life? So A, who's A? Okay, go ahead.
Okay, so I read A, and the technique I read about was the gratitude journal, and that suggested that you should keep a record on a weekly basis over 6 weeks, on which you count your blessings.
Great.
And the effect was that overall your life joy improved. Basically.
Okay, good. All right, who has B? Now, as the others are listening, they're going to be taking notes in their graphic organizers. So then as a team, they can co-construct a chart with all of the information. B?
So B is about acts of kindness. So, for example, helping an elderly person, playing music in an old people's home, or writing a letter to an aged relative. And the finding from this was similar to the gratitude diary, was that it boosted happiness, and particularly where people were doing it on a daily basis, and especially if they were doing it 5 times a day. So it made people happier.
Okay, great. Who has the gratitude visit? Go ahead.
So gratitude visit is, it was found that it is the most effective way to boost one's feeling of joy, right? And it consists in writing a letter thanking someone, a relative, a teacher, mentor, and then visiting this person to read the letter, right, to them.
Lovely. I like that one.
I had 3 blessings, and the process of this is to write down 3 things that went well during your day. And it was found that students who did this, or people who did this, were less depressed 3 months later and continued to be less depressed 6 months later.
Yeah, wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you. Great job. Okay, all right. So, thank you very much. Okay, so again, the graphic organizer as a scaffold, the language frames as a scaffold, and so we see I'm going to just kind of wrap this one up and see if you agree. But this time, we're seeing how information can be presented in multiple formats. That's part of 21st century skills because they create a chart that represents the same information as what's in the reading. They have to think very critically and analyze the information. You're going to now, in a second, you're going to sort of analyze and evaluate these particular principles or theories. And then you've also provided them with more academic language that they're going to need for success outside in those team projects or out in the real world. So the next step is that the learners are going to conduct their own study. So you each got a piece of paper. Did you get a little slip of paper? Okay. Now, you're going to have, again, 1 minute to ask, who needs one? Most of you have one? Okay, you can get started here in a minute. Ask people near you, how likely are you to try whatever your happiness booster is? Now, when we do this, the students are going to collect data and tally, just put a tally mark, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 people, for their question. How likely are you to try the gratitude journal, acts of kindness? Very likely, likely, somewhat likely, not at all likely. And at the same time, they ask each other why. We won't take time to do that, but if you could just collect your data for 1 minute, see if you can talk to maybe 2 or 3 people next to you, okay? And see what you find out. All right, now, you've collected data. So what do you suppose? Now, there are 4 questions. Maybe you have 20 people in your class, maybe you have 60 people in your class. You put people together in small groups, maybe 4 students, who have the same question. And they're going to compare their data sets and see, are they close? They might have to negotiate. What if their data is different? Ooh, is it valid? Well, we want to give them the language frames they need to analyze their data and talk about the data. So many people in class, 2/3 of the class, half the class, almost everybody. Okay, so again, so that's the language development that we're doing as language teachers, but at the same time, look at the rich critical thinking, analyzing the information, again, providing them the opportunity to create a graph, that visual representation of information. It's so learner-centered, and as both Sarah and Scott yesterday brought up these themes, the idea of things that are really challenging are going to be more engaging, that's more learner-centered. It's also, if you think of these as principles, these could become some of those principles we talked about. One of my principles is going to be that I'm always going to have content that matters. And how do I find that out? Well, I get to know my students. I ask them. I find out what are their next steps and make sure it's very situated to your local context and what's going to matter to them, right? Okay, so now I taught this lesson when I was co-teaching last fall. So I taught the lesson, and we had a very low-resourced adult education center. So of course you could do this with Poll Everywhere. They could create a graphic, a visual. But they did a paper one, and they were so delighted, and they were so excited when I emailed to ask if I could use their picture in the presentation. Okay, so hello from Tu and Alan. And so they looked at how likely are you to use 3 blessings, and they were very serious about presenting it very accurately. And then they did a gallery walk. So each pair had their poster around the room, and they walked around and looked and visited and presented to each other. So again, the kinds of skills that you're going to encounter in college, in further education of any kind, in work, okay? So let's see how we did. All right, so content that matters. Well, a very academic topic, meaty topic, research-based, okay? And hopefully it's of high interest. Just like the birth order one, everybody can relate to birth order. And even if you don't, I mean, even if you're an only child, or if you're in a country where it's mostly only children, people have said, I wouldn't use this in China. Well, why not? I mean, you could sort of look at what is the different dynamic in a family where there's mostly only children, and how might that compare? They also, in the birth order study class, they did their own study. They did a lot of challenging of the text. We talked about it's just a theory. What does that mean? Is it proven? Is it necessarily true? Okay? So the same thing here. There could be a lot of analysis, evaluation. And then this prompted critical thinking. And they're conducting research. It's a way to get them conducting research, analyzing data, presenting results. Okay, how about scaffolds? Well, we had the Venn diagram, the jigsaw, the cause-effect chart. So the chart itself demonstrates the context, the structure of the text, language frames, personal connections to the text to promote collaboration and a lot of critical thinking and making that thinking visible. And then finally, products. Remember, I talked at the beginning about products to demonstrate learning, create charts and graphs, presentations, and then they were mirroring a real-world task, collaborating with others for a concrete outcome and having to interpret that information visually. Okay, so here are the topics, and we did collaborating with others. At the beginning, I asked you, right? I asked you which of these you used. When we think about the activity that we just looked at from the book, you're showing, if you work with teachers, you can show them that these are the ways we can operationalize these skills and strategies, drawing on what you're probably already doing and you're already doing really well. It's about making it explicit and naming it and saying, well, if you use Jigsaw, you're not just working on reading for specific information, you're also working on X, Y, and Z. You're also learning to interpret information presented in other ways and engaging in a team project, right? So I want you to just think about which of these would teachers in your program readily use, okay? So that's just sort of a listing of the techniques we talked about today. There are others, of course, and I think we need to wrap up. No, I think we're good. Well, I'll be around. I'll be around over lunch if you have any further questions. Thank you so much for helping me out, team over there, and for contributing your ideas throughout. So I learned a lot from you. Thank you.